Simon, do you want to come in? Yes.
Can I just pick up something that follows on from that point? And actually, Niamh, you've raised this a couple of times as well. So if we look at international comparisons, so where either legalisation or liberalisation has taken place, I'm interested to know what the impact on crime is there and how dramatic it is and how quick it is if it occurs at all. So essentially, what does that transition period look like? And what other levers need to be put in place aside from changing the framework of the legislation to enable that transition, whether it's a public health response, whether it's something else, and what's worked and what hasn't?
I think, so if we start with decriminalisation, which is obviously just addressing the issue of possession and use in the main, we have approximately 35 countries across the globe that have taken this approach, and additionally probably about another 20 US states and a handful of Australian states in relation to cannabis only. In terms of how it impacts the wider kind of criminal landscape, I mean, certainly, obviously, one thing we see immediately is a reduction in possession cases. So that's the first thing. You know, criminal justice stats fall around people being prosecuted for possession. In Portugal, for example, they saw a significant fall in the prison population over the first 10 years of the policy. I can get you the specific stats, but from memory, it was about 15% fall in prison population, and so that was largely to do with the fact that, because Portugal wasn't sending lots and lots of people to prison for possession, but what it was is because people were able to access treatment, get the wider social support that Chloe's just referred to around housing, about making sure their economic needs are met, that crime fell, that kind of low-level petty crime fell, low-level supply.
I'll just chip in the specific stat on that one.
Okay.
We did a report which was fact-checked by the Portuguese drug agency on this. The proportion of prisoners for drug offences fell from 40% in 2001 to 15.7% in 2019, just to give you an idea of that kind of dramatic fall that is possible with all the beneficial implications.
Thank you. And then in addition to that, what we've seen is in the regulated markets, there's real work in the US. I mean, I think we have to recognise the scale of what's happening here. I mean, the last time this committee met in 2011 on drugs, there was not a legal market for cannabis in the world. We now have Uruguay, Canada, we have Malta has just come online, we have several countries around Europe who have committed to it, Mexico, 18 US states. You mean, the market, you can travel from the top of North America now right the way down to Mexico on the west coast, and it's a legal cannabis market the whole way down. I mean, this market will come to the UK. I have no doubt about that. Market will win. It's how that market works really matters, and I think it's really important for the committee to think about this. And we're seeing examples in the US of models which aim to bring people who are involved in the illicit market or those who have been over-criminalised because of prohibition into the legal market. So a transition from illegal activities into lawful activities. And that's something we're seeing in all US states that are currently legislating for a legal cannabis market. So New York, for example, has a very detailed proposal to ensure that criminal records are expunged to allow people to participate in the legal economy beyond just cannabis. We have licenses that are being prioritised for people who were over-policed or over-incarcerated for drug offences. We have loans going out. There is a whole kind of fora of really interesting economic models that seek to support people, not just in kind of traditional markets, but people who live in deprived economies, to get them involved in the markets or to participate in other opportunities as well.
If I could just add to that a second, I think the international context that you mentioned there, Simon, is so important, particularly not to dial back, but when we think about the question of, well, what was the purpose of the Misuse of Drugs Act in the first place? One of the main purposes of it was to be the realisation of the UK's international obligations under the Sin Convention's 1961 Act. And what's really interesting about that Act is that at that time, it was a 13-year drafting process to get the Sin Convention ratified at the UN, and a lot of the resistance and frustration was from the UK government and other European governments resisting the kind of American imposition of this kind of blanket criminalisation and prohibition. And so once the Sin Convention was signed in 61, the UK then realises its commitments through the 71 Misuse of Drugs Act. And then now in 2022, we look at the international context, and what Neva just mentioned about what's going on in the United States, it's a completely different environment that led to the Misuse of Drugs Act being implemented in the first place. 18 US states with legal recreational cannabis markets, and the consequences of the kind of social equity provisions that Neve mentioned go far beyond simply just moving people outside of the criminal drug market. And when we think about things like the commuting of sentences or the removal of criminal records, we're talking about allowing people who've been excluded from society in so many ways, from being able to access public housing, to being able to travel abroad, to being able to get certain jobs. The removal of their cannabis convictions is allowing huge amounts of people to re-enter society in so many ways in New York and California and Illinois. And I think that this is what we need to be thinking about when we think about the UK's drug strategy in 2022. That the context that led to the current system that we had is no longer being supported even by those who encourage the UK to commit to this approach.
Thank you. Now, I do want